Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX has a Falcon 9 rocket counting down to liftoff this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 15:43 UTC for those of you joining us in other time zones around the world. This mission will be launching 56 more Starlink internet satellites to join more than 3,800 Starlink spacecraft currently in orbit. These satellites provide high-speed, low-latency broadband to consumers around the world. This will be SpaceX's 20th launch of the year. The 56 satellites are buttoned up for liftoff inside the nose cone, the payload fairing at the very top of the Falcon 9 rocket out at Pad 40. The launch time has been adjusted this morning by 10 minutes from the earlier target launch time of 11:33. Liftoff is now scheduled for 11:43 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's an hour and 6 minutes and 30 seconds away. Preparations will really pick up at T-minus 35 minutes with the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. About 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen will be loaded into the vehicle in the final half hour or so of the countdown. The Falcon 9 will be heading downrange to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this morning, targeting an orbit inclined 43 degrees to the equator. These satellites are part of the older generation design called version 1.5 or V1.5 of the Starlink spacecraft platform. But they're joining a orbital shell or orbital pathway, essentially, that's part of the recently approved second-generation fleet of the Starlink constellation approved by the Federal Communications Commission back in December. So these are older design satellites going into part of the constellation that will eventually be populated largely, we believe, by new, upgraded, larger spacecraft. We'll be joined in a few minutes by Jonathan McDowell. He's an astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Massachusetts. He's an expert tracker of launch activity, and he tracks the status of mega-constellations, including the Starlink constellation. His website is at www.planet4589.org. So he'll be joining us in just a couple of minutes. We have a few questions for him about the Starlink constellation, and we invite our viewers, if you have questions for Jonathan, you can submit those in the chat. If we have time, we'll try to get to a couple of those. Now, 1 hour, 1 minute away from liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from here at Cape Canaveral. Weather conditions here locally are favorable. The latest weather forecast that we received from the 45th Weather Squadron indicated a greater than 95% chance of acceptable weather for launch this morning. It is a mostly sunny day, a warm day, a little bit of a breeze, but no issue with the winds or weather right now here at Cape Canaveral for launch at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time, 15:43 UTC. We're joined today by Jonathan McDowell, an astronomer at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He goes by the Twitter handle @planet4589, also runs a fabulous website, www.planet4589.org. It's the go-to site if you want any updates on changes and maneuvers in the Starlink constellation, as well as other satellite constellations by other companies. Also tracks all launch activity, all orbital launch activity there on planet4589.org. Certainly a great resource for me and other space reporters and space enthusiasts around the world. This mission will be launching, as I discussed in our opening, an older design satellite, an older generation of Starlink spacecraft called version 1.5. Late last month, SpaceX launched the first batch of Starlink satellites, upgraded Starlink V2 mini satellites. This is a larger, more capable Starlink spacecraft. SpaceX is reverting back to the older Starlink spacecraft design on this mission. And in recent days, Jonathan, as well as others who track the orbits of these satellites, have noticed something interesting about the Starlink version 2 mini spacecraft that were launched back in late February. And Jonathan, first of all, can you tell us what's up with those Starlink V2 mini satellites, and what did you notice in the data that you use?
Right. Well, so normally, right, what they do is the satellites will come off the rocket, they'll hang out for a few days at the deployment altitude of around 300 kilometers. Then they'll raise to 350 kilometers, stay there for a while, and then raise up to the operational altitude in the 500 to 600 kilometer range. And instead, what happened is that once they got up to about 350 kilometers, a bunch of these satellites, well, none of them raised further, and a bunch of them started to come down, slowly decaying due to the density of the atmosphere. And so clearly this was not as planned. They were. It looked like some of them were going to re-enter. They seem to have flattened out a bit now. And so, it's not really surprising, because even, let's take the constellations, aside. You're launching a new design of satellite. It is really not uncommon for the early weeks of flying a new satellite to discover, oh, we've got some teething problems. We have to debug some stuff before we can really commission the satellite. And so, the V2 minis are they're not completely clean sheet designed from V1.5, but there's a lot of new stuff on them apparently. And so we shouldn't be too surprised that they've got some teething problems. And so, as things stand right now, they're still not orbit raising. But they seem to have stopped decaying, at least some of them. So I think what we'll see, and based also on Elon's tweet the other day, I think some of them will be allowed to re-enter in the next few weeks, but some of them I still expect will be recovered and orbit raised once they've debugged them. So I think we just have to be patient and wait a few more weeks to see how they end up, how many they end up saving, I guess. And we don't really know what's wrong with them at this point. And from what I hear, it's a bunch of different things on different ones of the satellites.
Yeah, your tweet that kind of called attention to this got a reply from Elon, which confirmed that there are these unspecified issues with the Starlink V2 mini satellites, and we know based on our reporting that this particular mission, as well as one next week, which were originally supposed to carry additional batches of Starlink V2 mini satellites, these upgraded spacecraft, ended up reverting back to the older generation in the last few weeks. So they're launching the older batches of satellites that are a little bit less capable. They have we know that the V2 mini spacecraft have 4 times the broadband throughput of a V1.5 satellite, which is what we're launching, or what SpaceX is launching this morning. There's a lot new with these satellites, right, Jonathan? New communications, new propulsion. So, a lot of things they're testing out, right?
Right, that's right. I just want to clarify for users who may have come across that. There's been some confusion about them being called mini, right? They're a lot bigger than the V1s. They're only mini compared to the gargantuan V2s that we've been promised that are coming soon on Starship. So when they realized that Starship was not going to be as soon as perhaps they had hoped, they wanted to get some of the V2s up, and so far as I can see, they just sawed the V2s in half to make the V2 minis, and so they could fit inside a Falcon 9 fairing. But they have improved communication systems, and this is SpaceX evolves the communication systems. Just yesterday, they put in a filing for the FCC to add V-band capability to their future V2s. So it's not like V2 is going to be static. But yeah, there's definitely a step change in the capacity of the V2 minis, and also much improved thrusters. They've gone from the Krypton-powered thrusters that the V1s and V1.5s used to argon propellant thrusters. And that's really because there's going to be so many of these darn satellites that, even Krypton was chosen over the more conventional Xenon because it was cheaper. But it's still not cheap and abundant enough to use in the enormous constellation they're planning to launch. So argon is actually, people may not know, the third most common gas in the atmosphere, right? We learn in high school that the air is made of nitrogen and oxygen, but then the next trace gas down, it's not very trace, it's a couple percent, is argon. So you're not going to run out of argon, it's cheap. And so it's a really smart move, I think, for them to move to these new thrusters. But also, there are so there's a whole bunch of new technology on the V2 minis, and I think we'll sort of see some of that play out. There's also new strategies. They've developed the capability to change the orientation of the satellite a bit in terms of how they're going to try and reflect the sunlight away from the ground, which the astronomers very much appreciate. And so there's a whole bunch of new things that are going to be trying out on these V2 mini missions. And of course, what that means is there's all kinds of opportunities for things to go slightly wrong.
Exactly. I recall back in 2019 when SpaceX launched a big batch of 60 Starlink satellites, which they called, I think, version 0.9. They were prototypes, basically. There was a 6-month gap in between that launch and when SpaceX was ready to really begin populating the full network with commercial-ready, operational-type satellites. So there were some lessons learned during that, and we may be seeing something similar now with the V2 mini satellites. Good point. You raised a good point, Jonathan. These are very much larger satellites than the version 1.5, which SpaceX has been launching in recent years. 800 kilograms rather, versus about 300 kilograms for the older satellites. And the new satellites have a much bigger cross section in orbit. They have 2 solar array wings that span about 30 meters tip to tip versus just one solar array on the previous generation 1.5 satellite. So yeah, a lot of structural differences, and you raised a good point also about argon being cheaper. When you're launching thousands of these satellites, that is a concern. That is obviously something that has to go into the business equation for SpaceX. Astronomers have, you touched on this, astronomers have raised concerns and worries about the brightness or reflectivity of sunlight off these satellites as they're orbiting overhead, particularly around dawn and dusk, and potentially having these streaks from these Starlink satellites interfering with ground-based observations of space. These V2 mini satellites, and then later the full-size version 2 that will launch on Starship, much larger satellites. Any early indication of how bright these satellites are, the V2 minis that we saw just launched in February?
Yeah, although I'll take it with some caution. I mean, just to say a bit more, the solar panels on the V2s have a new backing that's darker than the backing that was used on V1. They have covered various parts of the satellite with these fancy Bragg reflection films that are going to decrease the reflectivity. And so from some angles, the prediction is that, per unit bit of satellite, the V2s are going to be as much as 100 times fainter than, or was it some large, orders of magnitude fainter than the V1s. So several magnitudes astronomically. But what we see so far, based on Tony Malama's observations of the V2 minis that have come up now, they're typically about third magnitude in their current orbit, which is pretty darn bright. And some of them even are some of the time are first or second magnitude. So that's very bright. But on the other hand, that's before they go to their operational orbit, and it's before they start their being oriented in the operational way. And so I do expect them to be much fainter once they finish debugging them and orbit raising them. But right now, second and third magnitude, those are like comparable to really bright stars. So I certainly hope that isn't how they end up operationally.
I know you and a lot of astronomers will be carefully monitoring that data, particularly as the satellites, at least some of them, may be drifting to or propelling themselves to higher altitude to get up to that operating altitude where they're going to be staying for a number of years. And, that's really where the satellites will be operating when there are thousands of V2 minis and V2 satellites in the constellation. So I guess the jury's still out in some regards there.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, it's 20 of these satellites in low orbit being really bright is not really a big problem, right? What we're frightened of is 30,000 of these satellites being bright, and so we really have to wait and see what they look like in their operational orientation, because that affects a lot how bright they actually end up being. So I'm in a wait and see mode on whether they will deliver. They've made some very encouraging promises about the technology they've added to make these satellites much fainter than you would expect. But trust but verify, right? Wait and see what it actually happens. It's too early to say.
Jonathan, you maintain a wonderful resource counting all of the operational satellites in the Starlink constellation, as well as, of course, the tally of all the Starlinks that have been launched to date, which I think is now more than 4,100.
Operators, the propellant load and launch go, no-go poll is open in stat 56.70.
We just heard a call from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch readiness poll is now underway, so the teams are being polled for their go or no-go to proceed into the propellant loading, which is due to begin in about 12 and a half minutes, T-minus 35 minutes. We'll have an update for you on that in a few minutes. Jonathan, going back to your website, planet4589.org, can you talk about how many satellites are currently in the Starlink constellation, how many are currently operational, and how many do you expect to see launched over the coming years based on SpaceX's statements and FCC filings?
Right. And so, so far they've launched 4,105 Starlinks, which is an insane number already. And of those, 3,802 are still in orbit around the Earth. So there's been about 300-ish that have re-entered already. So about 10% of them have already re-entered because they were retired early or failed or whatever. Of the 3,802 that are up, my assessment, based on looking at the orbits, is that there's about a little over 40 that are broken and derelict, and the rest are working to some extent, but several hundred of them are still in the orbit raising phase. And so if you look at how many are actually in the licensed shells that the FCC have said SpaceX can fly its satellites in, that's only 3,265, so a little over 3,200. So so I think what people don't appreciate is it actually takes a long time for the satellites to go from today launching on the rocket to being in the operational orbit. And then actually when they retire them early, what we've noticed probably is often it takes a long time for them to lower the orbits to reentry. It can take as much as a year because they lower them down out of the constellation to maybe 350 kilometers, where they will, re-enter in a short time if they're abandoned. And then they try and debug them for as much as a year before finally giving up and going, oh, okay, I guess we've got to get rid of this one. And so the consequence of that is that 10 to 15% of the constellation at any one time is in these lower orbits, which of course means they're brighter. And they're also, a danger to space traffic at lower altitudes. And it's kind of fun keeping track of the constellation and watching how they operate these satellites to understand their orbital deployment strategies. And so there's a lot of fun you can have in monitoring the open source information about orbits to really get an insight into how a big constellation like this operates.
For those of you just joining us, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. I'm joined by Jonathan McDowell, who's chatting with us a little bit about the Starlink constellation. He tracks the status of mega-constellations and global space launches at www.planet4589.org. If you have a question for Jonathan about mega-constellations, including Starlink, please submit that in our chat. We'll try to get to a couple of those if we have time. Jonathan, I don't want to harp entirely on Starlink. There are other mega-constellations out there. OneWeb is nearing completion of their first-generation network with roughly 600 satellites. Plans to launch, though, a follow-on network with thousands of satellites. And Amazon also has their mega-constellation for broadband with those first two satellites, prototypes, set to launch in a couple of months. Jonathan, how are those constellations looking in terms of both filling space in low Earth orbit? Any differences you see in how SpaceX is tackling concerns about orbital debris and reflectivity compared to OneWeb and Amazon?
Right, and so really, OneWeb is the only real competition right now. Right, they're the only other company that's launched significant numbers of constellation satellites. And their strategy is significantly different from SpaceX. They are in 1,200 kilometer altitudes, much higher, twice as high. And the implication of that is if your satellite fails, instead of re-entering within 5 to 10 years, it's going to re-enter, it's going to be up there for centuries. And so they really can't afford any significant failure rate on those satellites. So each satellite has to be much more reliable. And so far, they've had maybe one or two failures, but they're doing pretty well. Also, however, for astronomers, the higher orbits that OneWeb are in are actually, they're obviously better for the average person looking at the night sky because they're higher, they're fainter, so they're not really visible to the naked eye. But they're certainly bright by the standards of things astronomy telescopes are looking at, and because they're higher, they stay visible from one side longer. They're moving slower in the sky, and so all in all, they're actually much worse for professional astronomical observations than the SpaceX ones are. The saving grace is there aren't so many of them right now, and even in the final second generation constellation, as you say, they're planning to launch several thousand. I think it was about 6,000, but Starlink's plans are going to be 34,000 if you combine the Gen 1 and Gen 2 satellites, and so it's still much bigger. Amazon, you've got to pay attention to Amazon. It's one of the major players in the business world, but they haven't actually launched any of their satellites yet, and so we're kind of going, okay, let's see how it goes. There's another company called eSpace, And eSpace is worth knowing about because it's run by a guy called Greg Weiler, and Greg Weiler is actually the person who started OneWeb and O3B and things like that in the first place. He's got a long track record in the telecom industry, and his company put in this absolutely insane filing with the International Telecommunications Union for 300,000 satellites with a flag of convenience, filing it through Rwanda, and so that would be just a real problem for space traffic management and for astronomy. They've launched 3 test satellites so far, but it seems like those satellites probably didn't work. They're still not identified by Space Force. So either they failed or eSpace is being particularly irresponsible in not working with the 18th Space Squadron to be for safety of flight issues. So I'm a bit concerned about what that company is up to. We'll see. So yeah, and of course there are Chinese constellations being planned, and there are test satellites that are being launched. There's one Chinese constellation where the satellites look incredibly like the OneWeb satellites. I mean, they're just the same shape, the same size, and so I think of it as sort of like Chinese OneWeb, and so we'll see how those go.
There's a lot of activity to watch, and so many of these
launch
launches.
Director with abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD, and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch autosequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort autosequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
That was the voice of SpaceX's launch director giving instructions to the launch team in case they need to call an abort or a hold in the final automated countdown sequence, which will begin at T-minus 35 minutes in just about 3 minutes or so. Jonathan, we're going to wrap up our time with you now, but I just wanted to point out there are more launches. I think last year set the record for most orbital launch attempts in a year. And, so many of these, particularly with SpaceX, over half of them have been for these mega constellations. That's the trend, the way the market's going, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's space is busier than ever. I'm trying to keep up the data entry, but it's amazing I haven't got carpal tunnel at this point. And I see that continuing. I see more satellites per rocket, more rockets, and the only cloud on the horizon is just the lack of regulation that is driving us closer and closer to real problems with the space traffic management and the risk of collisions. The number of what we call conjunctions, where satellites pass very close to one another, has just increased drastically over the past couple of years. And so we've got to do something. There's actually one other problem I want to throw out before we wrap up, which is that it's not just the increase in the number of satellites and the number of launches. It's also the increase in the number of players. That there are so many startup companies and universities and so on launching satellites that the communication between the hundreds of different actors is a real issue now. And so I think the space industry is in a time of great development and great opportunities, but also serious challenges that we're going to have to address.
Yeah, good words to close out, Jonathan, and certainly tracking all these launches. I know it's probably a challenge for you as a reporter. It certainly is a challenge trying to cover so many launches, not only here at the Cape, but around the world. And Jonathan, we thank you for your time this morning, and best of luck. And for those of you who don't know Jonathan, go to www.planet4589.org or follow him on Twitter at planet4589. You won't regret it. Thanks, Jonathan, and we look forward to having you again sometime soon.
Thanks, Stephen. Take care.
Take care. SpaceX's countdown coming up on T-minus 35 minutes, which is, of course, the key time of the start of the automated countdown sequencer and the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9.
The launch auto has started.
And the launch auto sequence has begun. So the process to load liquid propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket is now underway out at pad 40. This begins with loading of liquid oxygen and kerosene into the first stage of the Falcon 9, followed by loading of kerosene, RP1 fuel into the upper stage. Liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage won't begin until about T-minus 16 minutes. Coming up on the half-hour mark in the countdown, at T-minus 30 minutes, loading of helium pressurant will get underway on the Falcon 9 rocket. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our stream. That helps us attract a larger audience for our coverage here at Cape Canaveral. So again, thumbs up or like button on YouTube if you haven't done so already. That would be greatly appreciated. T-minus 30 minutes and counting. This is the point that helium loading should be getting underway on the Falcon 9 rocket. The helium is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks as the propellants are consumed in flight. Helium is stored in composite overwrapped pressure vessels, high pressure storage tanks inside the Falcon 9. T-minus 27 minutes and 30 seconds until liftoff. We're now seeing some of the vapors appearing around the first stage booster on the Falcon 9 rocket as cryogenic liquid oxygen is loaded into the vehicle. The liquid oxygen tank begins about a third of the way up that first stage booster. At the very bottom of the rocket is the kerosene tank, and the kerosene, which is known as Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1, is closer to room temperature than the liquid oxygen, so you don't see the frost build up at the very bottom of the rocket. Above that, though, is the liquid oxygen tank. That's the largest single tank on the entire Falcon 9 vehicle, the first stage oxygen tank. And the liquid oxygen is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero. It's very cold, so you'll see frost and ice build up on the outer skin of that liquid oxygen tank. And if you look closely, you may be able to see the frost level rise up that tank as it's filled up for launch this morning. Liftoff remains scheduled for 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 15:43 UTC. For those of you who watch or track precise launch times, the exact launch time is scheduled for 11:43 and 10 seconds. That's 15:43:10 UTC. Coming up on T-minus 25 minutes and counting, propellant loading is continuing out at pad 40. About 1 million pounds of propellants will be loaded into the Falcon 9 during this countdown. The countdown is currently being run by a ground computer or sequencer, running through an automated series of steps to configure the Falcon 9 for flight. Tonight's mission, or this morning's mission, will be the 16th orbital launch attempt of the year from here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station or at neighboring Kennedy Space Center. You can see in this graph the rate of launches in recent years here at the Cape, growing primarily due to increased activity from SpaceX, which is labeled here in the darker shade of blue. So this is the 15th SpaceX launch of the year from here at the Cape, 16th overall. The other one was the orbital launch attempt, the test flight of Relativity Space's Terran 1 rocket, which occurred on Wednesday night. That rocket failed to achieve orbit due to an issue with the second stage ignition, but Relativity did gather a lot of data on the structural integrity of their 3D printed rocket, which withstood the intense pressures of launch, including max Q, the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. So Relativity seems pleased with the results of their flight, and it was a success in the sense that they were able to verify the structural durability of their 3D printed rocket. There was no customer payload on that mission. So that launch is counted here in this tally as an orbital launch attempt, along with the previous launches of SpaceX this year. This is the 20th SpaceX launch overall, including missions that have been based out of the West Coast Spaceport at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Last year, there were 57 orbital launch attempts from Florida's Space Coast. At the beginning of the year, the Space Force expected between 87 and 92 launches this year. Here's a look at the SpaceX countdown timeline. A few of these events have already been passed. The big one was at T-minus 35 minutes with the start of propellant loading, with liquid oxygen and kerosene loading on the first stage. At T-minus 20 minutes, the upper stage will be filled with kerosene fuel. It will also see a big vent from the strong back of oxygen vapor at T-minus 20 minutes. That's a chill down of the liquid oxygen loading line to prepare for liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage, which will begin at T-minus 16 minutes. And then in the final 10 minutes, the pace of activity really picks up, all under the control of the automated sequencer. At T-minus 7 minutes, the engine chill down will begin. This is a thermal conditioning process to condition the Merlin Wendy engines on the first stage for flight. At 4.5 minutes, the strong back will begin retracting from the Falcon 9. It will recline to an angle of just about 1.5 degrees from the rocket, and then it will make a more rapid swing back at liftoff to get out of the way of the Falcon 9 as it begins its climb off the pad. At T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded for flight, and propellant loading will be terminated. The fill and drain valves will be closed at that point, and the Falcon 9 will have a full launch weight of 1.2 million pounds with all of its tanks full. At T-minus 60 seconds, the ground computer, which is controlling the countdown, will actually hand over to the Falcon 9's flight computer, which will oversee that final 60 seconds of the countdown. We should hear a call from SpaceX's launch director at T-minus 45 seconds. The propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure using that helium that I talked about, which is also loading into the rocket right now. And then the engine ignition sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds. That uses a igniter fluid, essentially called TTAB, triethyl aluminum triethyl borane. It has a distinctive green flash that you may be able to see at ignition. It's easier to see at night, of course. And then if all 9 engines are performing well, the command will be given at T0 to open 4 hold-down clamps at the base of the rocket, and that will allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb off the pad. We're now seeing the so-called big vent from the strong back. This indicates that RP1 or kerosene loading should now be complete on stage 2. And chill down of the liquid oxygen loading system on the upper stage now underway. T-minus 20 minutes and counting.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
And there's the call from SpaceX launch and landing control just outside the gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where engineers are gathered overseeing this morning's countdown. So the second stage is now confirmed full of kerosene fuel. That's the first of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled this morning. Coming up on the 18-minute mark in the countdown. Again, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here in our YouTube stream. That helps us attract a larger audience as the SpaceX countdown enters the final 18 minutes until liftoff, which remains set for 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time, 15:43 UTC. And with the start of propellant loading, that effectively makes today's launch window instantaneous. SpaceX had 2 other opportunities this afternoon reserved for possible launch attempts for this mission, but they're going for the first of the 3 today at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time. In the next few moments, we should see the big vent terminate from the strongback. That plume of gaseous oxygen will go away, and at that point, liquid oxygen loading will begin on stage 2. If you want to support our coverage, there are a couple of ways to do so. You can contribute in the Super Chat here on YouTube. Your contributions help us continue doing what we do, bringing you live coverage of all the launches here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It also helps pay for the work needed to maintain our website at www.spaceflightnow.com, which has now been following global launch activity for 23 years. You can also support our coverage by clicking the Join button under our video feed here.
Stage 2, LOX load has started.
If you click the Join button, you can gain access to a bonus members-only video features depending on which membership level you select. Not only will you get access to those videos, you'll be supporting our coverage, and we always appreciate the support of our loyal viewers. T-minus 16 minutes now. The call we just heard from SpaceX Launch Control confirms that liquid oxygen loading has started on stage 2. So this is the final propellant tank to be filled this morning. Now inside of 15 minutes remaining in the countdown for the Starlink 5-5 mission, carrying 56 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. You're looking live at Pad 40 at the Cape, where the Falcon 9 rocket stands about 229 feet or 70 meters in height. The rocket is powered by 2 stages. On the first stage, there are 9 Merlin 1D engines. On the upper stage, there's a single Merlin vacuum engine that will do the final maneuvers to accelerate to orbital velocity to place these Starlink satellites into orbit this morning. Here's a look at the expected ground track for this mission. It'll be heading off to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station over the Atlantic Ocean. It's targeting an orbit inclined 43 degrees to the equator. And to reach a 43-degree inclination orbit from the Cape, you either have to go southeast or northeast. And in the winter months, in the last couple of years, SpaceX has been launching missions to the southeast to avoid high seas and rough waves that are located off the mid-Atlantic states, where the drone ship would have to be positioned for a landing for a mission like this. So this mission is going to the southeast, which climatologically has calmer seas this time of year. And the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, is noted here on this map about 410 miles or 660 kilometers southeast of the Cape, northeast of the Bahamas, there on that map. The red line shows the expected path of the booster stage as it makes its arc toward the drone ship. And then the green line shows the path of the upper stage, which will perform what's called a dogleg maneuver. It's a very slight right turn, as you can see in this map, that is necessary to avoid a direct overflight of the northernmost part of the Bahamas. And the upper stage will head off into orbit north of the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then flying just east of Puerto Rico over the Caribbean Sea to reach orbit this morning. Here's a look at the launch timeline. It'll take about an hour and 5 minutes from start to finish to place these 56 satellites into their targeted orbit this morning. The Falcon 9 will exceed the speed of sound in about a minute. It'll pass the maximum aerodynamic pressure point of the flight, or max Q, at 1:12 seconds. And then the Falcon 9 will follow a pretty standard profile. The booster stage will fire its 9 Merlin engines, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust for about 2 minutes and 27 seconds. A few seconds after that, we'll see staging, or stage separation, and then the upper stage will light its single vacuum-optimized Merlin vacuum engine, which is modified for more efficient firing in the rarefied atmosphere of space, where there's very few air molecules there to deal with. The payload fairing will jettison at 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and then we'll see the first stage begin its maneuvers to return to a vertical propulsive landing on the drone ship about 8.5 minutes after launch. And then the second stage will cut off a few seconds later at 8 minutes 40 seconds. That's when the Falcon 9 and the Starlink satellites will be in what's known as a parking orbit or a transfer orbit. It'll coast halfway around the world, and then at 54 minutes we'll see a very brief 2-second restart of the upper stage engine that will provide the impulse needed to place the Starlink satellites into their targeted orbit about 200 miles above Earth. Countdown just passed the 11-minute mark, 11 minutes to launch. Two minutes, 10 minutes and counting. Now inside of 9 minutes until liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. SpaceX performed a static fire test on this launch vehicle yesterday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. We don't normally see these static fire tests anymore before most Falcon 9 missions here at the Cape. Here's a replay of that test firing that occurred again yesterday at 9 a.m. A full countdown rehearsal to make sure the Falcon 9 rocket and ground systems are all ready for flight today. Engineers evaluated data from that test firing and gave the go-ahead to proceed with today's countdown. SpaceX only performs these test firings now on missions such as crew flights to the space station, as well as Falcon Heavy missions, which of course has 3 Falcon 9 cores bolted together with 27 engines in total, and on some missions that have seen significant or more significant refurbishment on the booster stage, such as replacement of multiple engines. We're not sure which is the case for the reason for the static fire yesterday, but it could have to do with some modifications or changeouts on the stage that SpaceX wanted to verify were all ready to go for launch this morning. T-minus 7 minutes, 37 seconds. Again, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. This helps us make sure that we're bringing this coverage to anybody who's interested in watching the Falcon 9 launch at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time, 15:43 UTC. So again, one way to help us out is to hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube page. Also, if you want to support our coverage, you can donate in the Super Chat, or you can join our YouTube channel. We have different membership levels for you to choose from depending on which level you select. You can gain access to members-only bonus features that we have produced just for our loyal supporters. So your contributions, either in the Super Chat or by becoming a member, help us continue to bring you coverage like this. The call we heard at 7 minutes was the start of engine chill down. This is the thermal conditioning procedure on the Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the first stage. This involves flowing just a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through some of the engine plumbing. This is a thermal conditioning process that helps protect the engines from the threat of thermal shock as the liquid oxygen
RP1 load complete.
rushes into the engine compartment at engine start. We now just heard that the RP1 load is complete on the first stage. So about 46,000 gallons of rocket-grade kerosene fuel now is on board the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes. I want to thank Simon Garibaldi for their support in the Super Chat. Thanks for that donation. 5 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff. Coming up on T-minus 5 minutes until liftoff of the Starlink 5-5 mission from Cape Canaveral, Florida.
Tanks are pressing for Strawback retract.
This booster is tail number booster 1067 in SpaceX's inventory of reusable rockets. It's flown 9 times before, going for its 10th flight to space today. Here's a look at its previous missions beginning in June 2021 with a space station resupply mission. It's launched in total 2 CRS resupply flights to the space station, as well as 2 crew missions, each with 4 astronauts on board to the space station. Also launched multiple Starlink missions, as well as communications satellites for Turksat and Eutelsat and SES. The guidance system on the Falcon 9 will be targeting an orbit today ranging between 185 and 210 miles in altitude. That's a perigee of 299 kilometers and an apogee or high point of 338 kilometers at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. This Launch will be adding 56 satellites to the fleet, going to join the second generation Starlink constellation. But as we mentioned earlier in our coverage, these satellites are part of the older design, version 1.5. SpaceX has paused temporarily the launch of upgraded, larger, so-called Starlink V2 mini satellites as they work out issues with the first batch of those upgraded, higher capacity satellites that launched back in February. Now inside of 3.5 minutes until liftoff.
Stage 1 LOX load complete.
First stage liquid oxygen loading is complete. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. Should hear a call momentarily that liquid oxygen loading is complete on stage 2. The strongback is now in position for engine start.
Stage 2 LOX load complete.
Now 1 minute 20 seconds until liftoff. We just heard the call that stage 2 liquid
close
oxygen
out.
loading is complete. At T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will be passed from the Falcon 9's ground computer, to the onboard computer aboard the Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 1 minute and counting.
Falcon is in startup.
We heard the call that Falcon 9 is in startup.
LD, go for launch.
And the launch director has given their final go for launch. The Falcon 9's onboard computer now controlling the countdown. 25 seconds. The water deluge sound suppression water system should be activated
30 seconds.
in the final seconds of the countdown. Engine ignition will be at T-minus 3 seconds. T-minus 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, carrying 56 more Starlink satellites to orbit. T-plus 35 seconds. Everything looking good so far. Falcon 9 now is supersonic and has passed maximum aerodynamic pressure, 1 minute 30 seconds into the flight. No issues reported so far. All 9 engines firing, producing about 1.7 million pounds of thrust, burning through that kerosene and liquid oxygen that was loaded in the countdown. Two minutes into the flight, less than 30 seconds until main engine cutoff. That'll be followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage. Ten seconds until main engine cutoff. We see main engine cutoff. It looks like there's a visual indication of ignition of the upper stage engine. We're going to switch over to SpaceX's feed now, which has an onboard view showing the engine on the upper stage now firing at a velocity of more than 8,000 kilometers per hour. Next step will be payload fairing jettison, and there is payload fairing jettison, revealing the 56 Starlink internet satellites as well as the blue ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, 93 kilometers below as the Falcon 9 continues climbing with the upper stage. The booster also continues climbing. It will arc to an apex or high point of its trajectory, using cold gas thrusters to maneuver itself to a tail-first orientation for re-entry. There's a view on the left from the upper stage looking down at the Florida coastline and the Atlantic Ocean with a scattered cloud cover.
Vehicles on a nominal trajectory.
3 minutes, 48 seconds into the flight. T plus 4 minutes. Four minutes, 28 seconds. The upper stage now has accelerated past a velocity of 10,000 kilometers per hour. That's more than 6,000 miles per hour. The upper stage
signal Bermuda
is now at 116 kilometers. A downrange tracking station in Bermuda is now receiving signals from the rocket as it makes its way to the southeast from Cape Canaveral. The booster has reached the high point of its ballistic arc. Now 113 kilometers and descending. We're about 3.5 minutes from the expected landing of the first stage on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas located about 400 miles downrange. Five minutes, 45 seconds into the flight. The next major milestone will be the entry burn. That'll use 3 of the 9 engines on the first stage to begin slowing down as it dips deeper into the atmosphere, now 85 kilometers and descending. That entry burn should begin in about 10 seconds. The feed we're getting here from SpaceX does come with a bit of a delay, about an 11 or 12 second delay in this video feed from SpaceX. That's why there are different
Stage 1
numbers
entry burn
on the
startup.
clocks you see here. And there's the start of the entry burn. Begins with a single engine and now 3 engines firing on the first stage. You'll note on the lower left the velocity is decreasing
Stage 1 FTS is safe.
as this retro burn is underway. It's a braking maneuver, 6,000 kilometers per hour and slowing. So that deceleration now complete.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down.
Entry burn is complete.
Stage 2
40
FTS is
kilometers and descending, heading toward the drone ship, the football field-sized landing platform floating in the Atlantic Ocean. 7 minutes since liftoff. Upper stage on the right continues
safe.
firing,
On a nominal trajectory.
17,000 kilometers per hour and accelerating, 159 kilometers altitude. So the split screen on the left is the first stage looking aft or down. On the right is the aft-facing camera on stage 2. Now about a minute from landing of the first stage. The landing burn is set to begin at 8 minutes and 5
Stage
seconds.
1 transonic.
We heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the first stage has now passed below the speed of sound. 8 minutes since liftoff. Less than 30 seconds now from landing of the first stage. Still getting a good video feed from the booster. Standing by for the landing burn.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 1 landing burn underway. The center engine of the 9 engines on the first stage firing to slow down for touchdown on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas.
Stage 1 landing
200 meters and descending.
Expected loss of signal Cape.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And we see visual confirmation, and we heard the call. You heard the call as well, I hope, from SpaceX Launch Control. Stage 1 landing confirmed. This booster has completed its 10th flight to space.
Expected loss of
And back
signal
shutdown.
Bermuda.
And there's confirmation of stage 2 shutdown. SECO 1, second stage engine cutoff confirmed.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And there's the call we like to hear after the end of the second stage burn, nominal orbit insertion. So the Falcon 9 has done its job so far today with the successful landing of the first stage booster, completing that booster's 10th flight in its nearly 2-year career. And the upper stage with the 56 Starlink satellites now coasting 151 kilometers above the Atlantic Ocean, nearing Puerto Rico, heading southeast. And that upper stage engine producing about 200,000 pounds of thrust placed the 56 Starlink satellites into the expected transfer orbit, or parking orbit. This is the preliminary orbit that the rocket will coast in now for about 45 more minutes before a very short restart at T plus 54 minutes to maneuver into a more circular orbit, setting the stage for release of the 56 satellites altogether at 1 hour, 5 minutes after liftoff. So a lot of the work is now complete for this Starlink 5-5 mission, but a couple of key milestones still to go. This was SpaceX's 20th launch of the year. Now 11 minutes, 11 seconds since liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Here's a look at some of the mission stats for today's flight. This was the 213th launch overall of a Falcon 9 rocket since its debut on June the 4th of 2010 from this very launch pad, Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This tally includes the suborbital flight of the Crew Dragon spacecraft on an abort test back in 2020. This was the 223rd flight overall of a Falcon rocket. That includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies since the very first Falcon 1 test flight in 2006. As we mentioned, this was the 10th flight of this booster, tail number 1067, 182nd SpaceX launch from here in Florida, the 118th SpaceX launch from Pad 40, and the 173rd launch overall from Pad 40. This is SpaceX's most used launch pad before SpaceX took over the lease for Pad 40. About 15 years ago, the launch complex was used for the Air Force's Titan rocket program, which began operations at Pad 40 back in 1965. The last Titan launch from Pad 40 was in 2005, and then SpaceX began flying from this launch pad in 2010 after some modifications to support their vehicle. This is the 153rd flight of a reused Falcon 9 booster, the 181st landing of a Falcon booster overall, including landings on SpaceX's fleet of drone ships and onshore landings back at landing zones either at the Cape here in Florida or at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. This was the 78th SpaceX launch with a primary purpose of hauling Starlink satellites into orbit, the 20th SpaceX launch of the year, and the 16th orbital launch attempt overall from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center so far in 2023. 15 of those now are SpaceX missions. One was the launch attempt earlier this week by Relativity Space's 3D printed Terran 1 rocket. As you can see, this map provided by SpaceX shows the location of the first stage, now stationary on the drone ship, northeast of the Bahamas after landing there. And the upper stage with the Starlink satellites coasting over the Atlantic just off the northeastern coast of South America. Be flying just northeast of French Guiana in a couple of minutes, and then cutting off the northeast corner of Brazil, and then heading out over the central Atlantic after that. About 40 minutes until the next burn of the upper stage engine. That'll be a very brief maneuver, 2 seconds, to give the impulse required to circularize the orbit and then prepare for deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites at 1 hour, 5 minutes after launch. That's about 50 minutes from now when we expect to get the confirmation that the mission is complete in terms of the Falcon 9 having deployed all 56 satellites into the correct orbit. SpaceX has concluded their live video coverage, so we won't get any live views from the Falcon 9 rocket during the remaining flight events this morning. However, their mission audio stream and this map showing the location of the upper stage remains active, and we also have continuing updates in our Mission Status Center throughout the remainder of the flight. Before we sign off, we want to take a look ahead at the launch schedule for the next few days, as we normally do at the end of each of our broadcasts. The next launch we'll be covering on spaceflightnow.com is scheduled for tomorrow night, U.S. time, early Sunday, UTC. That'll be the flight of an Indian GSLV Mark III rocket with another batch of 36 OneWeb satellites from the Satish Dhawan Space Center, located on the east coast of India on the Bay of Bengal. That mission, deploying 36 satellites, will complete the operational first-generation constellation for OneWeb with more than 600 active satellites. OneWeb has one more launch in their first-generation constellation planned in May on a SpaceX rocket to add some spares to their network. We'll be covering that again on our website at www.spaceflightnow.com, as well as on our social media pages. Next week, the next SpaceX launch from here at Cape Canaveral is scheduled for Wednesday, March the 29th at the earliest. That is another batch of Starlink satellites set to launch from Pad 40 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The same day, a Russian Soyuz 2-1V rocket, a core-only version of the Soyuz, is slated to launch according to airspace warning notices from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in northern Russia with a Russian military satellite. And then another SpaceX launch is tentatively scheduled for no earlier than March the 30th, next Thursday, from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. A Falcon 9 rocket will carry a batch of satellites into orbit for the military's Space Development Agency. This launch, called Tranche 0 of the SDA Constellation, will carry the first set of satellites for the SDA's planned fleet of communications, data relay, and missile detection and tracking satellites. This is part of a next-generation mega-constellation, or large constellation at least, of hundreds of satellites that the military is developing and building and launching for data relay support and missile tracking for the nation's defense. Here's a look at Pad 40 one more time, the empty pad where the Falcon 9 departed 18 minutes ago to begin this mission. We'll have continuing coverage, including the tracking map and some updates from the mission audio stream on our Launchpad Live channel, or Launchpad live stream, rather, for the next hour or so as we await confirmation of the final burn of the upper stage as well as the deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites. So go over to Launchpad Live now for continuing coverage. We're going to sign off our dedicated stream here on YouTube now. Thanks for joining us. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm editor of Spaceflight Now. I want to thank our team, Stephen Young, for their video support and production support for this broadcast, as well as Clive Simpson for providing updates in the Mission Status Center blog that you see if you're on our website under this page. So until next time, thanks for joining us. Have a good weekend.